OK, well, Rex Tillerson is on this story. He's just in South Korea. We just saw him land a little while ago. Now, the thing is, North Korea is a major headache for this region. Now, the point is that it's being dealt with always the same way, it seems. And, you know, Einstein's definition of insanity is to keep on doing the same thing over and over again, hoping for a different result and not getting it. Now, what needs to be done which is different?
Well, this is an important visit for Rex Tillerson, and he's got North Korea firmly in his sights. I think the policy options for the United States are very limited, other than trying to apply leverage to China. Everybody assumes, quite rightly, that China has the maximum potential leverage on North Korea. The US has relatively little, other than to try and co-opt China to do what it wants to do. But whilst there's this tension in South Korean Chinese relationships that largely revolves around the deployment of the US missile defense system, it's really hamstrung. So actually Rex Tillerson has very few policy options. So this trip, I'm afraid, we're not going to see any significant breakthroughs. This is a fact-finding mission. He will be cautious. He will be careful. He will be trying to establish the parameters of the US-China relationship, both in terms of regional flashpoints like North Korea and also ahead of Xi Jinping's proposed visit to meet President Trump in April in the US.
Well, absolutely. Now, how will Pyongyang look at this visit? That should be interesting here as well.
Pyongyang will be looking for the maximum opportunity for mischief-making out of this situation. In some ways, what Pyongyang likes more than anything else is to be the centre of attention. And for now, it's absolutely getting that. Everybody thought that in the early months of the Trump presidency, they would try and ratchet up the stakes, try and draw attention to themselves, and see what concessions they will be able to extract both from China and from the US. In a sense, we have a policy with North Korea which is they're naughty and we give them sweeties, they're good and we give them sweeties. We talk a lot about sanctions, we talk a lot about ratcheting up pressure, but mostly, historically, it's been a question of kind of conceding ground to North Korea in, to date, the vain hope that somehow that kind of activity is going to elicit a different response from them.
And Richard, the other flashpoint as he heads to Beijing, of course, will be the stance on the South China Sea. In January, in his confirmation hearing, Tillerson had said, he thinks the US should block access to these islands that were built by China, likening it to Russia's annexation of Crimea from Ukraine. Do you think that stance is going to be continued as he goes into these meetings?
No, I don't think it will be. I think he will be walking away from some of the comments he made in his when he was first being reviewed for the job, as it were. I think that will not be the topic of conversation. I think they will try and dance delicately around that issue. For now, they want the summit in April to go well. They want some kind of accord on what to do about North Korea. They want to South Korea at the moment is much more, or the Korean Peninsula is much more important, North Asia is much more important than what might be happening in the South China Sea. So I think the kind of diplomatic initiative from the United States will be to park the South China Sea for now, concentrate on the upcoming summit and concentrate on the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah, and the big unknown risk for markets so far this year is really that trade and currency policy when it comes to China. And there's so much noise about it. There's very different positions being taken depending on who you look at. Navarro, quite aggressive when it comes to dealing with China, and Mnuchin seemingly, a little bit more restrained, saying actually ahead of that G20 finance ministers and central bankers meeting that the US doesn't want a trade war. Who is actually driving policy here, and where do you think the position is going to land in the end?
Well, you have to assume at the moment the Mnuchin, Gary Cohn, Rex Tillerson, James Mattis camp, if they are a camp, and we can kind of loosely group them in the kind of traditional Republican mainstream, you have to think that they are broadly in the ascendancy right now. And the Steve Bannon, Pete Navarro group is somewhat lost ground. But who knows? This is a very fluid, it's a very dynamic situation. There is, I think, a market assumption that traditional Republican values and traditional Republican policy is going to take precedence, and that's going to be the kind of driver of trade policy with China. Certainly, that's what Wall Street seems to be believing at the moment, and it may be kind of willful. It may be they want that to be the truth so much that people are almost willing that to be the case. I suspect there is still more of a delicate balance of power going on within the administration, within the White House, but the assumption for the moment is that that group, as it were, is going to kind of win out. And Rex Tillerson is very much in that kind of mainstream Republican, stable international trading conditions kind of view of the world. After 41 years in ExxonMobil, that's everything you need to know about his kind of world outlook. It's not about trade war, it's not about currency fluctuations, it's not about sudden lurches in economic policy, it's about stability.
Well, Richard, on that subject, really, you know, you've not mentioned really in the whole thing Donald Trump. And, I mean, he's at best whimsical, so how far can you rely on him actually playing a straight bat and keeping his word and not changing his mind?
I think so much is going to depend on the personal chemistry with him and Xi Jinping when they sit down together. If you look at what Prime Minister Abe did of Japan, he was in Trump Tower just after the election. I think he was the first international leader to actually go and actually meet then Donald Trump before he became president. And then once the inauguration had taken place and he became president, Prime Minister Abe, I think, was the first major international leader to be greeted by Trump. They played golf in Florida. They spent the weekend there. They've obviously created some kind of relationship. And to Prime Minister Abe's credit, he understood that what matters in this kind of relationship is personal. And I think he understood that if you form that personal relationship, you get to know the person, you have the kind of personal time together, the way Donald Trump's mind works, it's much harder for him to then turn against somebody that he has actually formed some kind of bond with. I think there is a sort of personality aspect here that Abe has completely understood. So I think we'll see what happens when Xi Jinping gets to Florida, how the golf goes, how the weekend goes, if that meeting takes place in early April. And I think that's when we're going to know something about the longer-term intentions of how this administration is going to deal with China. What is for sure is that it is going to be more abrasive. There are going to be more bumps in the road. I think the US-China relationship can probably take that. It can probably take a little bit more kind of fractiousness without it necessarily snapping. We saw actually when the whole one China policy issue came up with a phone call from the president of Taiwan, we saw that the Chinese actually exercised quite a lot of restraint. They are playing the long game here, and I think there is probably room for them to have, on one level, a bumpier relationship with the United States, as long as it's kind of underpinned by something that is probably quite personal that sits behind that. We'll have to wait and see, but I think that's probably the way the cards are playing at the moment.